future. Here's what you can expect from today's League Day Zoom webinar. You will hear from 3 other speakers, myself and 3 other speakers. And today our topic is voting in a time of pandemic. Let me begin with an introduction of our first speaker, Alma Kravite. Alma is the National Organizing Director for the League of Women Voters US. She's responsible for building and developing the needed grassroots power of the 800 local leagues with its 85,000 plus members, directing them to defend, expand, and protect voting rights for all to achieve our true democracy. Our next speaker, it will be after Alma, Dean Logan. Dean C. Logan, Registrar, Recorder, County Clerk. The department is responsible for registering voters, maintaining voter files, administering federal, state, local, and special elections, and verifying initiatives, referenda, and recall petitions. LA County, with more than 500 political districts, 5.2 million registered voters, is the largest and the most complex county election jurisdiction in this country. So we will hear from Dean, and then following Dean, I don't really need to introduce our very own Debbie Fagan, who is on our board and is also chair of our advocacy committee. And Debbie is going to walk us through some LWV advocacy opportunities. So with that, I will bring up Alma Kravite.
Hi, everyone. Afternoon for me. I am in Maryland. This is Alma Kravite. I'm the organizing director with the League of Women Voters in the US, based in DC. I am going to be sharing my screen with you. So bear with me for one moment. And we're going to be talking a little bit today about the federal advocacy and the action that we are putting together for elections, making sure that Pasadena is election ready and that every city and every state in our country is ready for our elections. So the League is very focused right now on ensuring that the 2020 election, one of the most important elections of our lifetime, is conducted in a safe and secure manner that gives everyone the opportunity to participate. The policies that we're tackling today are ones that we can work to implement in every state and jurisdiction as we march forward with the primaries and the general election. 3.5 stimulus bills so far, the biggest one being the CARES Act that has passed in early April. And it included $2.2 trillion of total funding and $400 million in funding for elections. But we know that this is not enough. So just yesterday, the House leadership introduced legislation that needs, this was 2 days ago actually, the House introduced legislation that meets the funding threshold that we have been asking for of $4 billion. The HEROES Act includes an additional $3.6 billion in funding for states. It requires states to offer online and same voter day registrations, that states offer at least 15 consecutive days of early in-person voting, and includes a requirement that no excuse absentee vote by mail is available and accessible to all voters with postage paid by the government. You can see on our LWV.org site the statement that was published by our President Chris Carson, commending the House for passing this bill. Senator McConnell has stated that he does not see the urgency for more funding, but we hope that negotiations with the Senate and with the House will move quickly, not only to ensure funding for our elections, but also to ensure that provisions for the health, safety, and welfare of all Americans move forward. We already know that if we want this to happen quickly, they are gonna have to hear from us. So every state is different. And in different places, there are different needs and different relationships with their election administration. But overall, the need for safe election policy can look similar everywhere. We need several things. We need a robust voter education so voters understand their options to participate and that they understand the changes that are being made to keep them safe, whether they choose to vote early, in person, or by mail, or at a polling location on election day. The nature of the pandemic keeps us in our homes and unable to visit government offices that would normally help us to register early. Now is the time to give people the option to register online from the safety of their homes, or allow them to register when they show up early in the early vote or during election time. Early voting states should expand early voting options and allow at least 2 weeks of early voting in person to reduce long lines and administrative stress on election day. Early voting sites should follow the same procedures outlined for polling places, which we already know about keeping safe distance and using all the safety precautions that have been recommended by the CDC. No excuse absentee mail ballot options should be made available to all registered voters. Polling places must be adequately sanitized to prevent transmission of the virus, should follow guidance by the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention, including requiring sick poll workers to stay home, regularly cleaning frequently touched surfaces, disinfecting potentially contaminated surfaces such as voting machines and other equipment, and frequent hand washing and sanitizing. Polling places should be reconfigured in order to adhere to social distancing protocol, creating additional space between voting booths, poll workers, and voters standing in line. In order for this to work, what we need to make sure is that on election day, only those that have to do it in person because they need assistance, because of language barriers, because they live in places that is the only option that they have, that they can do it. And in order to do it safely, everyone else that has a different option for voting, whether it's by mail, absentee, or early voting, should take it. So we declutter the line at the end and we keep all options and we keep everybody safe. So what can we do to make sure that this moves quicker? Let's contact our representatives and senators. Let's demand action from Congress to protect the 2020 election. I would urge you to call your senator and your representatives today. You can also work with local and elected officials to do that and to drive a strong message. So when we call the senators, what are we going to say? Let's ask them to ensure, not endure, we want them to ensure that $4 billion is included in the next COVID stimulus package. This funding will guarantee that state and local election administrators are to implement the policies necessary to keep voters safe in the remaining primary and the general elections. Voters should not have to choose between their health and their right to vote. We have developed additional resources for all states. I would encourage you to visit lwv.org/COVID guidance about tips on how not only to get prepared for voting in this time, so how do we communicate this to others? How do we keep our members and our leaders safe and engaged during those times? And there's a lot of tips about how to using also technologies and tools to continue to organize and to do the vital work to make sure that everyone that can vote can do it safely in the primaries and in November. And within these resources, you can also find resources to organizing and build power. You're gonna find webinars about how to run these meetings and doing engaging. There are community meetings where people are coming together to share best practices. All of these trainings and webinars are being recorded and documented. So feel free to go into the site, check what we have online, and register for the upcoming trainings. If you have any questions, again, my name is Alma Couvertier, National Organizing Director. Here's my email on the screen. And please reach out if you have any questions or you would like to participate in the field organizing efforts.
Alma, we do have 2 questions for you. Thank you for your presentation. The first question is, how will the appointment of the new USPS Postmaster General affect the use of mail-in ballots?
Very good question. Selena, who is from our advocacy and litigation team, is actually looking at this piece. The league has already pronounced themselves in support of funding the U.S. Postal Service. Beyond voting, the U.S. Postal Service provides a critical service to this nation. And it is the only way that many of our friends and families have, for example, to get their medications delivered. It's not only about voting. Voting is a big component and is critical during this year, but let's not forget that the way that the U.S. Postal Service is intertwined into our lives, we need it to function, and we need it to function well. The League has already stated their positions supporting this effort. And Selena is going to be sending very soon talking points and messaging, not only on this issue, but also in how to then support the bills that are going to make sure that not only elections get funded, but also that our postal service get funded as well. So more on that to come. We definitely have a position in support of making sure that the post office is fully funded.
Thank you. The second question that we have is, how is the LWVUS most challenged in the current pandemic environment, and how will that affect your work in November?
I would say that it depends on the team that you are asking this question. We have the advocacy and litigation team. I am in the organizing and mission impact team. There is a communication team. A lot of the work that we do already happens virtually because we have to cover a great territory. So that, I guess, is more natural for us. From an organizing standpoint, is how do we make sure that even if we're observing social distancing, how do we make sure that people keep connected, that keep active, and that feel supported? And more importantly, during these times, how do we connect as humans and as people? We tend to come into this thinking always of the work, which is very important, that it needs to happen. But this is a moment to connect at the heart level and to make sure that we understand that we are all in this together, that we care deeply about one another. And even when we're doing the work, we're doing it moved by the love that we have for each other and for our country. How do we make sure that through social distances, we're still reaching out, having those connections, picking up the phone, having that important conversation with members that might be struggling, that might be stressed, that might be anxious and dealing with a lot, to feel that this is still home, that the League is a place of connection and support, and that together we're going to make things better for everyone.
I think we're ready to hear from Dean Logan.
Thank you. Great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. Let me first start by saying I hope everybody is doing well in these uncertain times. It certainly is an interesting period of time to be doing lots of things, but in particular conducting elections given the conditions that we're operating under. And I appreciate the opportunity to share with you a little bit about what we're doing in LA County, and to thank you for your partnership, as always, with election administrators here in LA County, but across the country. The League plays such an important role in helping us to ensure that voters are educated and that they're aware of their options for voting. And I can't think of a time where that's going to be more important than leading into the 2020 election cycle. So let me share a few things with you through this slideshow, and then happy to take your questions and look forward to, in the days, weeks, and months ahead, working with you as we prepare to administer the November election. So a little bit of kind of what's happened in Los Angeles County. As you all know, we rolled out the new voting experience in the March election. That was not without issue, and I certainly acknowledge that, and we are working very hard to address the challenges that we faced in March, as well as incorporate those into the preparation for the November election, given the changes that are taking place under the pandemic conditions. So just a quick review: Los Angeles County has adopted the Voters' Choice Act model of elections under California State Elections Code. That means we have moved to the vote center model, where in-person voting takes place at community vote centers located throughout the county, and any voter in the county can go to any of those locations to cast their ballot. At those locations, check-in is conducted through electronic poll books, and voters use the new ballot marking devices, which allow features for language accessibility, disability access, and just ease of casting a paper ballot. The ballot is still a paper ballot. It does, the device does not count the ballot. It marks the ballot. It then goes into a secure ballot box and comes back and is centrally counted in our headquarters. Under that model, as it exists in state law, voting starts 10 days before the election at a certain number of locations, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then 4 days before the election, so the Saturday before Election Day, the number of locations increases through Election Day. That's all augmented by, of course, the vote by mail process that is also a key part, and now will become an even more key part of the voting process here in Los Angeles County. I want to address real quickly a few points from the March election. I know the focus here today, and we appreciate that, is the November election, but I think it's important that just to acknowledge at a very high level some of the key points from the March election. So in that rollout, under the model that I just described, we had nearly 1 million voters who went to vote centers during that 10-day voting period in the March election. Interestingly enough, and this is data that we didn't have before and data that we need to pay a lot of attention to, is that only 27% of those in-person voters voted during those first 10 days, that early voting period, and 73% of the in-person voters went to vote centers on Election Day. And that was one factor that contributed to some of the choke points on Election Day at vote centers. I want to be cautious to say that was not the key point. I mean, I think that had all other elements of the system worked as intended, that in and of itself would not have been an issue, and we never want to speak poorly about voter participation. In fact, we would like to see higher voter participation, as I know all of you would, but those are the statistics. I think what's interesting to note about that is, from a voter outreach and education standpoint, is I think the real message here is that when you switch from a model that has existed for decades, and for most people their entire voting life, they associate voting on a random Tuesday between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. So moving away from that is going to take more than one election cycle for that to become part of voters' behavior. So we would caution that we don't want to simply throw out that 10-day voting period as a result of these statistics. We want to look at new and creative ways to ensure that voters know about the 10-day period. And of course, there was also the factor in the primary that this was a presidential primary, and leading up to the election, we literally days before the election, we still had candidates for president who were dropping out of the contest. And so that may have contributed, it's hard to measure that, but may have contributed to the number of voters who intentionally waited until Election Day to cast their ballot. And so those are factors that we'll be looking at. In addition to that, we had over 1.14 million voters cast ballots by mail in this election. That compares to about 3.5 million who were mailed vote by mail ballots. So this was an interesting thing that we noted as well, is that although we mailed ballots to 63% of the voters in LA County, of that 73% that voted on Election Day at vote centers, over 400,000 of those voters had also received a vote by mail ballot. So there's some messaging again in there to indicate that even with a vote by mail ballot, at least in Los Angeles County for the foreseeable future, there seems to still be a high demand or high interest in going to vote in person. We did some post-election surveys as part of our report back to the Board of Supervisors on the issues that happened in the March election, and I think that those are telling as well. So I think on a positive note, 70% of the voters who responded to the survey indicated that they did have a positive voting experience. 20% indicated that they had a poor voting experience, and 15% indicated, of those surveyed who responded to the survey, indicated that they had wait times sometimes as much as 2 or more hours. Obviously, those are conditions that are unacceptable, and 20% of people having a poor voting experience is not something that we aspire to or that we are proud of. So while the 70% is a nice indicator that the model itself is going in the right direction, it's incumbent upon us, an imperative that we address the issues so that we drive down that 20% and that we don't have those kind of wait times at polling locations on election day. So in response to the March election, a few things have happened. We did a comprehensive report back to the Board of Supervisors that was issued at the end of last month that addressed all of the issues. That's not what this presentation is about, but that is available, and we can make that available to your members if desired. That's also being validated by a third-party independent consultant, and we are heads down working with our team as well as some assistance that's being provided through the California Secretary of State's office to prepare and address these issues heading into November. So with that, what does this mean for November? And I think the most important thing is to first note that on April 28th, the LA County Board of Supervisors made the decision to, based on COVID-19 and the pandemic conditions, to take action to move LA County to the model where every registered voter will receive a vote by mail ballot, and then we will continue to augment that with the in-person vote centers. So again, in March, we mailed ballots to 63% of our registered voters. That will now be every registered voter in LA County who will receive a vote by mail ballot in the general election. Shortly after that, a week or a week and a half after that, the governor of California issued an executive order, and that is actually going to be the model in place across California based on the pandemic. Every registered voter in California will receive a vote by mail ballot, and then each county will address in-person voting either through their participation in the Voters' Choice Act model or through polling places on election day. The governor did indicate when he issued that executive order that he would be putting out further guidance at the end of this month about in-person voting. So we are anticipating further guidance on that as well. So a snapshot of the general election, that means we're moving to mail an additional 2.5 million vote by mail ballots in LA County. So just to put that in perspective, the increase from 63% to 100% of our voters may not seem on its face significant, but that really is the equivalent of adding on top of what we have traditionally done in LA County, adding the size of San Diego County or Orange County on top of the vote by mail ballots that we had previously sent. So we are working diligently to identify the resources, the space capacity to process those ballots when they come back in, as well as doing public education. LA County is unique in that we have a very diverse electorate. In particularly, language access is a big issue in Los Angeles County. So if we're mailing ballots to every registered voter, we need to do outreach in advance so that voters know that they have the option to request a ballot in an alternative language other than English. And we want to do that proactively well in advance of the election, so we don't put voters in a position where they receive a ballot in English and then have to wait and request another ballot in order to get a ballot in their preferred language. So we are working towards that now. The vote centers themselves will now be subject to the guidance of public health directives with regard to the pandemic. And so we will need to enforce personal protective equipment for our election workers as well as for voters, and social distancing. So things like spacing voters 6 feet apart who are in line to vote, sanitizing the voting equipment after each voter votes, requiring voters to wear face coverings. Those kind of things are things that we will be looking seriously at. Well, we will be imposing those in November, but how we educate and how we prepare for that is particularly important. We've been fortunate, if you want to say that, in Los Angeles County, that we have actually had the experience of conducting 2 elections under these conditions recently, much smaller elections. On April 14th, we had municipal elections in the city of Lancaster and Arcadia. And then just this week, we had the congressional special vacancy election in Congressional District 25, where we did mail ballots to every registered voter, but we also had vote centers. In this case, we used our mobile vote centers and our our external pop-up vote centers in large parking lots where we were able to achieve this social distancing and ensure a safe and secure voting experience for the voters and the protection of our election workers. So that will be moving forward in November. We are still planning, based on the Voters' Choice Act, for voting to begin in person 10 days before the election, and for that to increase the number of locations during the final 4 days. That is subject to additional guidance through executive order of the governor or any legislation that may take place. For LA County, it is about 700 locations total. Would be the floor based on the current law, but again, that may be modified by executive order. But we also recognize, even in March, we exceeded that minimum requirement in terms of number of locations, and recognizing that turnout is anticipated to be very high in November, we anticipate that we will exceed the minimum requirements for vote centers in November as well. We also will be expanding the number of vote-by-mail drop boxes. These are the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week secure external boxes that are available throughout the community. We had, between the boxes and then partnerships that hosted drop-off locations in the March election, we had about 206 locations in the March election. That will increase now to about 370 or close to 400 drop-off locations or drop boxes for the November election. So that does give the voters the opportunity to drop off their ballot in a way that still ensures the security of their ballot, but also prevents them from having to go into an in-person voting experience where they may feel uncomfortable given the pandemic conditions. I think I covered this, but this just gives you a little idea of the types of things that we have put in place in these last 2 special elections that we've conducted under the pandemic conditions. We have another one coming up on June 2nd, so we'll continue to refine this. This is all subject to additional guidance through the Department of Public Health. So this is not stuff we've come up on our own. This is stuff we're working in partnership, literally on a daily or weekly basis with public health officials. So voters are in LA County would be required to wear face coverings when visiting a vote center. We actually provided face coverings if they did not have those. We have those available for voters who show up. Election workers are wearing protective gloves and masks. Social distancing is enforced at the check-in and voting process, so we space out using cones and tape to make sure that there is social distancing between voters. The ballot marking devices are sanitized after each voter, and gloves are provided if voters request that as well. So things like pens and styluses are cleaned after each use. So just finally, just a little bit of timeline of what does this look like. So we're in a compressed time frame, obviously, between now and the November election. Sample ballots go in the mail September 24th. Vote-by-mail ballots will go in the mail to all of our registered voters on October 5th. And then that's when voting would be available at our headquarters. So as soon as vote-by-mail ballots go in the mail, we are open for in-person voting in our headquarters, assuming there is no restriction on the public facility at that point. And then October 19th is the official voter registration deadline. Of course, we in California have same-day conditional voter registration, but in a vote-by-mail environment, in order to receive a vote-by-mail ballot, a voter will not have to be registered by October 19th. So that's another reason why the in-person vote centers are so critical, is because that is still where same-day voter registration can take place. So anyone who misses that October 19th deadline is still able to register and participate in our elections. The 10-day vote centers open October 24th, and then of course election day is November 3rd. So a lot of activity heading into that. We will be running an extensive media and outreach education campaign. We learned a lot, again, from our March election on that. We will be focusing on messaging that encourages voters to cast their ballot at home in the safety of their home, and to have confidence in that vote-by-mail process, including informing them on methods they can use individually to track their ballot, to make sure that they know that it gets back to us, that it's been verified, and that it has been counted. And then, of course, also for those voters who need the in-person voting experience for accessibility, language, or after that voter registration cutoff, we'll be advertising and messaging that as well. And we'll be, as we have in the past, sharing all of those materials, education and outreach materials, with our community partners. And because of the size and reach of this county, it's so important that we have those partners to help escalate those messages and expand that further into the community. So that's a snapshot of kind of where we're at right now. We are moving full scale ahead in preparation for November, again, addressing those issues that took place in March, and also building on the success from March, where we learned a lot of positive things from our pop-up vote center locations, where we took them out into the communities to serve voters who were experiencing homelessness, or to go into places that were already providing public services, so that we were out in the community where voters were, and that gave them the opportunity to vote. We're going to look at expanding that as much as possible in November as well. And we look forward to continuing to partner with all of you and appreciate your continued support. Last thing I'll mention, and the prior presentation was excellent, an excellent summary. We're watching closely what's happening on the national and state level in terms of legislation and resource support for elections in November. So the advocacy for additional federal funding beyond the $400 million that was already allocated, and just to put that in perspective, California is poised to get about 36 million of that 400 million, and LA County would probably get about 9 million of that 36. The expansion of the vote by mail is estimated to cost close to $11 million in addition to what we previously did. So that 9 million is already sucked up by the expansion of vote by mail. So we are continuing to advocate for federal and state resources to help support the election in November. So with that, I'll stop and take questions. And again, thank you so much for having me and for your ongoing support of the elections process.
Thank you, Dean. One of the questions that we had is just to understand the challenges you actually face to ensure that 100% of LA County voters get a mail-in ballot for the November election. And can you also mention what kind of research partners you have to help you determine the best practices for expanding voting rights and the use of vote by mail?
Sure. So let me start with the first question. I think that's an important question, and we have been in touch, both working in partnership with the Secretary of State and a large gathering of advocacy organizations across the state of California that literally started the week after the March election to begin thinking about this. And the good news is, the word we have received from the U.S. Postal Service is that they do have the capacity and are at the table working with us in partnership to prepare for the volume that will take place. We are in regular contact with our existing vendor partners, so our printing and mailing partners that put together the vote by mail ballots on the outgoing side also have indicated and demonstrated that they have the capacity for this. Internally, we have to increase our resources on the incoming side when the ballots start coming back. Given the increase in volume, we're going to need additional space simply just to process those ballots. And even in that environment, we're going to have to provide for social distancing and different procedures than have taken place in the past because of the pandemic conditions. We also still need to make sure that that's transparent so people can observe and watch that process. So we're working on those procedures now. As far as the research partners, we have a number of different research partners that we're working on to help evaluate what we've done in the past, but also to advise us on what we're doing moving forward. So we have a partnership with Caltech that actually had people out in the community observing voting in the March election, and has quite a bit of research experience with the vote by mail process. There's an organization called Vote at Home, which is led by Amber McReynolds, who's a former elections administrator from the city and county of Denver, Colorado, who has put out a lot of guidance on how to do this on a statewide basis. And of course, LA is larger than most states, so a lot of that guidance applies to a jurisdiction the size of LA. We're continuing to work with our VSAP advisory committee, which includes members of the league, includes members of the political parties, language accessibility advocates, disability advocates, to be sure that they're providing their input as well. So there's a lot of ongoing dialogue and work going on around that.
Thank you, Dean. I think we'll turn it over now to the next phase.
All right, so now we are happy to introduce our very own advocacy person, Debbie Fagan, who will walk us through what we can do now here in Pasadena area. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you to our speakers for continuing the LWVPA's tradition of providing yet another informative and educational League Day. So we are now going to move on to the portion of the program where you can use the information learned from today to affect change. As Alma and Dean have articulated so well, election reform and building a robust system is complicated. Like our voters, there is no one size that fits all, making a system that works for everyone complex as well as expensive. So when asked to come up with an advocacy portion for today's League Day, I knew the focus would have to be on the upcoming election, but without ignoring the realities of our now normal. Repercussions from the pandemic will be felt for months, if not years. Many in our community are struggling today, and my reason for combining a mix of both advocacy and volunteerism. Hopefully, for those of you listening in, something will strike a chord and inspire you to help. As Dean and Alma reported, there is a tremendous amount of work being done to advance voting rights and election reform. In addition to what they reported, the LWVCA is also working closely with the Secretary of State's office to provide Governor Newsom with a set of recommendations for holding successful elections. But even with all this excellent work, none of it should translate into taking things for chance or becoming complacent. Therefore, I have compiled a short list of suggestions so that you can take action now. I've divided them into 3 categories, beginning with advocate. You should never underestimate the power of writing or calling your representatives. The health risk posed from the coronavirus demands changes to our election process, and the federal government must respond accordingly by allocating the necessary funds for all states to implement proper measures to safeguard the integrity of our elections. Second, volunteer. And there is a caveat for high-risk individuals should exercise caution. LA County still experiences low voter turnout. With our democracy on the line, voter education and outreach are more important now than ever. Our Voter Services Committee is working on plans to address everything, from combating misinformation to working alongside other organizations to encourage voter participation. Consider volunteering with Voter Services. And let's make history with the largest voter turnout this November. As mentioned, it is also vital to maintain on-site in-person voting centers. This requirement, along with the aging demographic of our typical poll worker, will result in a shortage of volunteers. Poll workers are desperately needed. Volunteer. And if you cannot or should not, encourage others to sign up. Another unfortunate outcome of the pandemic is that millions will likely experience extreme poverty due to the economic instability. There are numerous ways one can volunteer. Because our league serves 13 cities, I suggested the LA Food Bank, though there are many other wonderful opportunities where one can volunteer that may be more local to you. In Pasadena, for example, there is Meals on Wheels, the Foothill Unity Center, Friends Indeed, and others. To wrap up, I cannot stress the importance of donations as a means to help. We recognize that not everyone is in a position to extend assistance this way. But for those that are, there are some organizations that can use a lifeline at this time. So here are some suggestions. Give blood. There is a shortage, and it literally saves lives. Give cash. Again, I only listed a few suggestions: the LA Food Bank, news subscriptions, or your favorite nonprofit or cause. I paraphrase, but it was Martin Luther King who said, "Only in darkness can you see the stars." I hope you will not allow your spirit to be broken. Rise up. And now I'll turn the program back over to Catherine.
And now, thank you very much, Debbie. I think Pat has some closing comments and instructions to give us.
So I'm asking that you, number one, mark your calendars for Thursday, June 25th for our once a year annual meeting. The call to meeting will be in the upcoming June voter, which you will receive in maybe a week or so. And it will have all instructions on how to register for the meeting. And if your member dues are current, you will receive specific information on how to vote for the upcoming annual meeting. Your dues must be up to date for 2019-2020 fiscal year. I'm just encouraging you to, go onto our website when you're in doubt about what's coming up or what you might need to do in order to get onto the next program. That information is there. Now I'd like to just thank everyone for this today. I want to thank our speakers, Alma Caverti, Dean Logan, and Debbie Fagan for arming us with the crucial information that we need going into this upcoming November election. I also have to thank the people who actually made this happen. I'm still kind of blown away. There's Alma. Thank you so much for being with us again. We're going to adopt you as our honorary Pasadena area US member or something. I appreciate you using the photos from our February meeting and our March and so forth today. Thank you so much. And thank you to Dean. I'm not sure if he's still available to see on the screen. We know that Dean is extremely busy. There he is. We thank you so much for taking the time. These presentations were excellent today.
Thank you.
It really gives us information and I think inspires us to do more, even more, to make sure that November is a huge success. And we know that LA County is right up at the top of the list in terms of making a difference for our whole country. So we thank you. Debbie, you have actually inspired us to do more. And thank you for that information. That information will also be available. We will post it on our website so that you will be able to access some of the tips that Debbie gave us. I have to thank our events committee led by Catherine Gavsky, and also our communications committee led by Dorothy Keene and Gail Oswald. This has been terrific. We could not have done this without you, and we look forward to the next opportunity. I appreciate everyone's time today, all of the attendees for coming and being a part of this, and I do hope that we will see all of you again in June. Now, I understand, and maybe Catherine will tell me whether this is true. Do we have time for some additional questions, Catherine?
I believe we do. If Dean Logan can kindly stick with us for a minute or two more. We did have one question that wasn't addressed yet, and
Okay.
also for Alma. So Dean, the question that did come up was specifically that someone wanted to know what detailed steps will be made for specific outreach to non-English speaking voters on the vote by mail.
Sure. Yes. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay, good. So yes, and I did address that in the Q&A in the written questions. So I posted an answer to that. So we are doing a direct mailing to all registered voters in the county, informing them of the vote by mail process, and in that we will include information about language options and the availability of ballots in all of the required and available languages in LA County. But that in and of itself is not sufficient. We'll also be working with community partners to do targeted outreach in specific communities where we know, based on census data and other demographic analysis, that there are populations of voters who speak languages other than English. So we'll be doing targeted outreach there. And in particular, for some of our required languages, they are much more micro populations throughout the community, and we want to be sure that we do outreach in those areas, make sure that they know, A, that vote by mail ballots are coming, but also that they're available in the additional languages. So that's the plan at this point. We're open to additional feedback on that and working closely with our Language Accessibility Advisory Committee in that regard.
Great. And one final question, if you have a second, can we assume that the locations of the drop-in voting centers are being reviewed? Apparently in the spring, there were a number that were poorly located, had bad internet service, and so on.
Yes, so I mean, there's a lot that I could say about that. I don't think that our research indicates that it wasn't so much, the network connectivity was not so much an issue of the locations, it was more of an issue with the electronic poll books, and so that is being addressed. We are doing a complete evaluation of the locations, recognizing that we're going to need larger locations and locations with more capacity because of the social distancing requirement, and places that just simply have more space to spread people out. And we're moving away from the smaller or what we call mini vote centers, and looking for, again, larger spaces where we can have more e-poll books and more voting devices and move people through quicker.
Great, thank you so much. We appreciate your coming here.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add a last comment. I want to remind ourselves that we need to recalibrate our expectations and give ourselves space for the process that are put in place to work. If we do our work well, we will see historic voter turnout by mail, by in-person, absentee voting, by all of the mechanisms that we want to make available to the voters. And this is a great problem to have. But we need to make sure that we are preparing ourselves mentally to face a different experience on election day of what we're used to. And that we don't allow the naysayers to equate the needed time to be able to count everyone with accusations of fraud. So we need to support our elected officials that are doing this work. We need to communicate this to our leaders and our volunteers. And we need to support those volunteers and the poll workers so they can count everyone safely. So that's what I wanted to say as a closing comment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and much needed comment. Thank you so much. Let me just thank all of you once again for being here. Thank you, Alma, thank you, Dean, thank you, Debbie. Thank you for our 80 attendees. Boy, I wish you could hear a resounding applause for that. It's perfect, wonderful. And we ask that you stay safe, that you be well, and we hope to see you back with us on June 25th. Bye now.
Bye.